Hello, everyone. This is Jamie Henkel. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at PFLAG National. Thank you so much for joining us today as a part of Something to Talk About Live. As always, I am going to introduce my colleague, my partner in crime, a very good friend of mine, Jean Marie Nevada, to lead today's conversation.
I'm ready. I'm totally ready.
Wonder Woman, what are you doing here? I thought I was bringing Jean Marie into the room.
I know you could also call me Princess Jean Marie of Themyscira because I am totally ready for today's presentation, Jamie.
All right. Well, I'm still convinced that it's just Wonder Woman that's leading today's conversation. So I don't know where Jean Marie is.
She's gone. Jean Marie is not here anymore. Thanks, Jamie. We'll see you in a little while. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Nevada, and I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National, although right now you can just consider me one of the Amazons from Themyscira, because today we are going to be talking about one of the greatest characters of all time, Wonder Woman, and her appeal to the queer audiences. So if you want to follow along in our conversation today, you should visit straightforequality.org/discussion series, where you can download today's article and the questions that we're using for our conversation. So just so you know, our article today was actually in the Washington Blade, Washington, D.C.'s queer newspaper, and it was written by John Paul King, and it was called Queer Fans' Love of Wonder Woman is Bulletproof. And today I have two great friends coming in to help us with the conversation. The first one is Eric Peterson, and Eric's a senior consultant at Cook Ross in Washington, D.C. He's a diversity and inclusion consultant. He's also the co-host of the Rewind Project, which is a podcast which looks at old movies. And his first novel is coming out this year, which I'm super excited about, and it's coming out from Bold Strokes Books. So Eric, it's so good to see you.
So great to see you. It's been too long.
I know, we're reunited and in the perfect context. And let me bring in our other friend for the conversation today, Court Lane.
Hi.
Hello, Court. How are you?
I'm
And
good.
Court is a member of the Kids and Family Advisory Council at GLAAD. He is a former staffer at Marvel Comics, and he is a fabulous creative, and he has come ready to discuss Diana, Princess of the Amazons. So welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
I'm so excited about this. In case you couldn't tell, I'm not even going to take the tiara off. I've made an executive decision. So it was the plan, but now I can't. I just can't. So I want to talk to you both, and maybe Court, you can start, and then Eric will jump over to you. So where does the queer appeal of Wonder Woman come from? I mean, she has a huge fan base among our people. So talk to me a little bit about it.
Wow, I think there's a lot of ways to look at it, and I think that's why it's so powerful. I don't think there's one perspective. I think there's a lot of layers of queer appeal, and the first is that William Moulton Marston, when he created the character, presented her in a non-heterosexual environment where she was raised. A man wasn't even involved in her birth. There's clearly lesbian love relationship, physical relationships going on in those early comics. It's just little boys reading it had no idea what they were looking at, because it was so I mean, you had girls baked into pies, which weren't really baked, but just lots of girls in interactive, romantic, even sexual contexts. And so then that was built in, that was baked in. And heterosexual norms are something that Wonder Woman didn't understand or didn't really appreciate, because that wasn't her experience, and patriarchal society wasn't something that she understood. And that was very intentional from William Moulton Marston. And then I think in terms of the gay man appeal, which I really believe developed later, and particularly with the advent of the 70s show, is that, you know, Wonder Woman has a couple superhero attributes that are typical. I was at Marvel a long time, and every superhero has specific attributes. And yes, she's powerful, and yes, she is brave. But she is also nurturing, which is extraordinarily rare for a superhero. And she's also fabulous. You can't say those things about Batman. And I think that's critical to her gay male appeal. And she also, and I think this is important, there's a transformative element that came about in the 70s show that they continue in the comic, the ability that she could transform herself from regular to fabulous. And across the board, all of those elements and her sort of perspective on the world, which doesn't adhere to gender norms, I think is appealing even to trans and non-binary people. So that was a lot, but that's my perspective.
But there's so much to say. Eric, add on to it and talk about it.
Yeah, I kind of come at this from two different angles. One, I think that there's there's a lot of gay appeal to superheroes across the board, and I just think that the secret identity has so much to do with that, right? I mean, anybody who was, and as the world evolves, hopefully we're leaving most of our secret identities behind. We're out wherever we are, but growing up, I think there was certainly something about Clark Kent ripping up his, then there's the big S underneath, and there is that kind of normal to fabulous kind of thing. There's also, for me, I'm a huge fan of anyone that you would describe as a diva. So, from Liza Minnelli and Betty Davis to Barbra Streisand to Judy Garland to Madonna to Lady Gaga to Wonder Woman. To me, there's this thing about it. And one of the folks who responded in the Blade article actually said this, and I think said it perfectly. There's this need for young gay boys to see strength that is not packaged in masculinity. Because when you're feeling a little bit less than masculine, Batman doesn't make you feel better about yourself, but Wonder Woman does. It's not that I want to be a woman, but I can see that it's possible to be strong without necessarily getting into all those masculine trappings that as a little gay boy, I was sure I would never be able to meet. And so to me, those are the two things about Wonder Woman in particular. Now, there are all the female superheroes I love. My heart actually kind of belongs to Barbara Gordon, Batgirl / Oracle, and all of her guys' Birds of Prey, best comic ever written as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot there, but Wonder Woman clearly is the female. She is the iconic female superhero. And so, that's just something that, my heart belongs to her as well.
It's funny when I think about when I was a little girl, we had Wonder Woman and we had Supergirl sort of in the mainstream. And there was always a consciousness for me as somebody who would eventually come out as gay, that she was coming from this place that was all women. And that fact as a young girl who didn't have access to a ton of superheroes at the time. I mean, I come from a big comic book family, so comics I had access to a lot of them, but I mean, the only one that you really saw a lot was Wonder Woman back in the day. And that she came from an island of women and there were no men there. That actually went a really long way in my head. And I think it's one of the reasons that while there are lots of other characters I love Barbara Gordon, I'm a big Jean Grey fan, I always come back to Wonder Woman because I think it felt so safe. It felt like something that was almost for us, even though it wasn't really for us in the first place. So, one of the things that I think is interesting is that both of you have kind of made references at different points to sort of the different ways that Wonder Woman has appeared. And of course, I didn't put this in the questions, but both of you, would you talk a little bit about, because Court, you mentioned the show during the 70s, and I think that actually played a huge role in the queer appeal of Wonder Woman. Do you think that the show and more recently the films have actually pushed this idea even further into queer spaces as well as the mainstream ones?
I think in terms of awareness, yes, but in terms of the actual content, I think the comics, both in the 40s and in the last couple decades, have really pushed that narrative much further. And I'm hoping that the films will take up the mantle and be very comfortable with presenting Diana as bisexual and presenting the characters in her life as queer.
Yeah. And Eric, the 70s show, big role?
I watched it, certainly. I mean, I am right in the middle of Generation X, so like that on both sides, I'm like squarely in the middle. So that was I was 6, 7, 8 years old. And yes, I mean, the most exciting memory of my childhood was watching her spin around 3 times past the motorcycle outfit into the wetsuit. I mean, that was just like mind blowing. I loved it. But I have to say, one of the things that always frustrated me, and kind of this goes to the 1984, film version of Supergirl, was that, male superheroes always got like the star treatment in the movies and TV shows. And the female stories were always just these exercises in pure camp, which I love me some camp. But I love the fact that Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman are seen by many people as the finest movies in both of their franchises in a lot of ways. I mean, just, and I love the fact that Marvel, even though it was made a lot later, if you have to watch all the Marvel movies in order, Captain Marvel is the first one. She is like the original superhero of that cinematic universe, which is just cool. But yeah, I mean, women are finally getting films that are not made just for women and queer fans. I think it's kind of cool that they're being made for, you know, anybody who just wants to see a kick-ass movie can go see Wonder Woman. And, you know, especially the first one, you know, was just considered by everybody to be this amazing film, period, end of story. Not the most amazing woman superhero film ever, just a really fantastic film.
Just a really solid one. Well, I want to talk a little bit about her identity, because that's sort of what we're talking about here. And so both of you know this, back in 2016, one of her writers basically defined that she is in fact a bisexual or bi plus character, which I think, you know, for a lot of people was kind of like this, duh, but to actually have it said was pretty important, although there is the argument that if it doesn't actually appear on the panels, it didn't actually happen in canon. But we're just going to say that it's out there and it seems like an obvious thing. Do you think it is important that her orientation was defined in terms of making her more accessible to some audiences? Do you think it needs to be said? And do you think that saying this has actually influenced the way she's perceived in the mainstream? And I'll let whoever wants to go first on that one.
I'm of two minds about this, because I think it is important, particularly for straight boys and girls reading these comics and experiencing all the content, to understand that she is not specifically straight. And I think it's wonderful for young queer audiences to appreciate her that way. But I do wonder, in her original presentation, she was not heterosexual by any means. She really didn't see gender norms or queerness at all, because of the, you know, Paradise Island was a wonderful world of women who loved each other. So the idea of labeling her in that way is kind of not true to her original concept, but I appreciate the need for it for our culture today.
Eric?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I kind of, I feel like I'm going to open a can of worms when I say this, but when the announcement was made, I was like, either build her a romance with a female character that lasts a couple of seasons, or else Dumbledore. I mean, it just kind of felt, you know what I mean? It's just kind of one of those things. It's like, okay, it's nice to say, but if you don't, you know, let us see it. So I was a little frustrated by the announcement. And like, I always just feel like she's been queer from the very beginning. She comes from Paradise Island. I mean, even if you just take queer away from even just pure sexuality, her sense of gender, because of the way that she is and where she's from, is just fundamentally different. And so, yeah, for her, I think she would meet, you know, a gay couple or a lesbian couple and go, oh, okay.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, I mean, you know, and yet it's funny. I went back to prep for this and read her very first appearance in the comic world, you know, by Charles Moulton, right? The pseudonym was in there. You know, she does, you know, compete to wear the Wonder Woman mantle and leave because she met a cute guy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that really is kind of framed in some ways as part of her motivation for becoming Wonder Woman. And so, yeah, I do think that it's cool that we're now kind of saying, I hope the label is followed by some action, literally and wink, wink, figuratively, for her as well. I'd like to see that. I really hope that Patty Jenkins picks that up and says, yeah, let's go with it.
Court, did you want to add anything on that?
No, just, I mean, what you're really talking about is that Wonder Woman has always been about love. And actually, if you don't mind, for just a brief second, I have the text of William Moulton Marston's original pitch. And it's an interesting story because National Comics was getting a little pushback about the hypermasculine, violent nature of their comics. This is something that would haunt them in later days. National is the precursor to DC. They had an advisory board and brought him in because they were concerned about parental backlash. And he pitched them a show, or a series. And the text is, Wonder Woman and the true message of love binding shall come forth into the atmosphere of the earth. And all earth entities shall see that light and feel that vibration, and their consciousness and feelings shall be aroused. And they will reach for that message and awake to know who they really are. And they will separate themselves in consciousness from the fast fading systems of belief of the Saturnites. I'll explain that later if you want. Wonder Woman, and the message of love binding put forth into the atmosphere of the earth. So it's about truth and love. However that presents itself, and it's really a radical concept for the time. And
it's a radical concept for this time. I'm blushing.
Yeah.
Seriously. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I think that was one of the things, if you look at the original Wonder Woman comics, there is so much of a theme of love. I mean, there are also some interesting other things that pop up. One of the interesting things, and because Eric, as you mentioned, leaving Paradise Island, later Themyscira for because of a man, one of the stories that popped up sort of early on, was the fact her best friend was kind of jealous, and they sort of created this storyline, Mala, who was very jealous of her going. And I think that it was kind of interesting that they sort of inserted that there. And again, it's all up for interpretation, but I think given what we know of the universe, it's sort of set up that there in fact are relationships there, and that she was making a choice. But I think there's lots of double entendres in Wonder Woman.
But it's funny, when I was watching the film, and I was watching the first Wonder Woman film, the Gal Gadot, and she saw a man for the first time and thought he looked kind of dishy. The first thing that occurred to me was like, is she gay in the Themysciran context? Like, is that weird? Like, is she a sexual minority in her own society? Like, it just kind of and that's the great thing about this whole setup, is that it queers everything to where the queerest thing you can be suddenly is heterosexual. Which is mind-blowing, because then heterosexuals who read it go, oh, that's me, right? And so it's just a really fascinating thing for, no matter what your orientation is, there's some questions you're going to ask yourself. But of course, I think when you're talking about Wonder Woman's appeal to queer fans, hopefully we've already asked ourselves those questions. We've arrived at this place, and now we can just revel in how queer the whole thing is.
And it is. I mean, it really is. And I think there's so many metaphors that we can look at across the superhero universe, but I think there are just some characters that really lend themselves to this conversation. And I think Wonder Woman is certainly one of those. And I think that Wonder Woman, from the beginning, obviously influenced the development of other female characters. And Wonder Woman underwent her own pretty radical transformations over time. Like, she went through a couple of ugly times, like the 60s, where they took her costume away, and there's been a lot of changes for her. But one of the things that we're also seeing that's really exciting is the fact that Wonder Woman is not the only one. And this is not the only time we're having this conversation anymore, that there are so many characters out there in the comic book universe and in the fantasy universe who now either openly have been identified or have identified as queer, or who have been or who have been read in so deeply that we sort of now have established these identities. So I'd like to hear from both of you. What are you seeing with these characters emerging? Are there things that people should be looking for? Are there comics or characters that you think people should be watching? Or are there overall themes that you're seeing in terms of the way the characters are treated? Like, I think one of the very interesting discussions that we can always have is, how is it that we want these characters to appear? Do we want it to be that it's just they're given the label and then that disappears? Or do we want to see the investment of their identities integrated into the larger stories, which to me ultimately is our goal? So what should we be looking for? What should we be watching, and what trends should we be watching for?
Well, I'll just start by kind of saying, first, and I'm not a scholar of comic books. I read them as a child. I still read a few titles. Today, I'm definitely kind of mid-range in terms of fandom, but there is a whole world of comics beyond DC and Marvel. I mean, that just kind of needs to be said and goes without saying. And there's lots of stuff that's been pushing the envelope for a really long time. But yeah, I mean, I think that when you're looking at some of these kind of mainstream kinds of voices, there are some things that need to be put out there in mainstream society, and then there's nothing wrong with just every once in a while something for us to enjoy. One of my favorite moments in a theater ever, dipping over into the Marvel space right now, is in that scene in X-Men when young Iceman had to come out to his parents as a mutant. And the first thing that his mother said was, well, Bobby, have you ever tried not being a mutant? And every gay person in the theater fell out. And it was just one of those things like, there's something just inherently connected to our community about this whole superhero genre that I think is just inextricable. And so, I think what to look for is just that, what new artists and new voices will bring to it. I'm just looking forward to letting their creativity just spill out in the world and surprise us. But I certainly am not a prognosticator.
Court?
Well, you asked what I would recommend watching, or what other content with strong queer female representation. First of all, this is pretty obvious, but the recent She-Ra series on Netflix is extraordinary, with all kinds of queer representation across the spectrum, and ends very well. Noelle Stevenson did a beautiful job. The recent 2 seasons of Harley Quinn, which is not for kids, but a very exciting and funny animated series with a queer storyline that really pays off at the end of the 2nd season. And then also, and I happen to be a Harley Quinn fan as well, there is a graphic novel that is really tween and teen friendly by Mariko Tamaki. It's a Harley Quinn graphic novel that came out earlier this year. It won an Eisner Award for her, and it is extraordinary. And there is a lot of gay male queer representation and strong female friendship representation. It's beautifully done. And Mariko Tamaki is a wonderful lesbian creator who is on fire right now.
You know, I think it's kind of exciting to look across almost any comic franchise, like any of the comic brands. People have stuff going on. I mean, I've been a huge fan of stuff that Boombox is doing and Boom Studios. Lumberjanes is an amazing series, and I have seen it appear at so mmany queer events now. People have it on their tables. They're talking about it more. And I think if you look at sort of the creative team, we're seeing really diverse creative teams. I also was kind of curious, and we didn't really plan on talking about this, but I want to throw it out there. How do you both feel about some of the stuff that we've been seeing on television? I mean, there's been so many queer characters inserted into, for example, the CW universe, whether it's Batwoman or we look on Black Lightning. Certainly there were there were conversations in nearly all the franchises that CW is doing. Do you think that this is a trend that we're going to see continuing, or do you think that maybe this is literally just a trend? Do you think that maybe people are seeing superheroes as something beyond just the costumes now, and that we're going to see a lot more of this sort of used in sort of social justice work too? I mean, what do you think about the shows that are happening? Are they helpful to having these conversations?
I think that they are. Always get that you have to hand it to certain creators for trying. The amount of work that queer writers and creative talent are getting in television right now is extraordinary. One of the things that I'm asked all the time on GLAAD's Kids and Family Advisory Council is, can you recommend some queer writers, like a queer female of color? Can you recommend a list of writers?
Yes.
And you know, it's interesting, in the kids and family category, we created the council in 2017 because there was almost no queer representation in kids and family entertainment. We announced the award, we gave out some awards. This past year, we had so many nominees. It was such a huge category. So we know that there had been an enormous shift. And so for next year, we're dividing it up into 2 categories because there's literally too much content to contain in one category, one for older kids and one for almost preschool and younger kids. And that's just kids, not teens and adults. So yes, the amount of representation, and particularly in this kind of genre show, is really prevalent. I mean, we're honestly, GLAAD had some targets for where they wanted to be in terms of queer representation in television, and the television business has outpaced that by about 3 or 4 years. Film is another story, and that's where I think GLAAD is working with studios to do better.
That's amazing. You know, and it's interesting when you say it, when I think about the queer representation on superhero programs on television, it is so open, so obvious. I mean, it is very bold. And yet when I think about how it has been carried out in the movies, it's either not there or, like X-Men, it's all kind of a metaphor for stuff. Eric, I actually have a question for you, because you're another diversity and inclusion person like me. Has any of this stuff come up in when you're doing your work? Because I mean, often pop culture becomes part of the conversations that we find ourselves having. Have you found that people have been asking you about this, or that you have started using some of these as points to illustrate changes that you were seeing?
Well, I tell you, the meteoric kind of shift in this whole conversation where comic books met diversity and inclusion was obviously found in Black Panther. You know, what that meant to audiences of color, I think even took most of them by surprise. It was one of those things like, oh, we've got a superhero movie of our own, Chadwick Boseman's in it, cool, let's go see it. And people would report to me that at the end of they were weeping, right? Yeah. I mean, not only this idea that a hero could look like me, but also this vision of Africa as being the technological center of genius of the universe. it didn't preach about it. It just said, this is what it is, and you must accept it if you're going to go along with this movie. Just, I mean, to me, the power of representation was that's the film that I go to say, this is pop culture and art is important, right? I mean, it seems like we're having a fun conversation about Wonder Woman, with this great organization, PFLAG, that's dedicated to activism and making people's lives better. Do those things go together? And yes, they absolutely do, because the stories that we tell ourselves has such a huge impact on the way that we see the world. And the need to see yourself in stories is such a uniquely human trait that transcends culture. It doesn't matter where you are. We all thirst for stories, and we all seek to see ourselves within them, right? And so if we don't see ourselves within them, we will insert ourselves into those stories. But it's so rewarding to not have to do that work, to just see yourself up on screen. So yeah, I mean, I tend to think that all representation is important. Sometimes, can it backfire? Sure. I mean, if it's done badly, now we're at a place where the LGBT community is going to complain if they see something where they see themselves represented and they don't like it. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but the prom got itself into a bit of a, everyone was talking about that because a lot of people didn't like that representation. And so for the first time, we weren't just grateful. We actually said, and actually, I liked the prom. I was okay with it. But yes, to always strive to do better is so important. And my final word on that is, this is an important conversation. It's fun, and Wonder Woman gives us joy, and it doesn't make it any less vital that we have these conversations, really understand how the culture works us.
I think I keep saying to people, I think it's like the best time to be alive if you're a giant super geek nerd like I grew up. I'm like, who knew suddenly I'd be talking about this for my job. We're all talking about it for our jobs. How did that happen?
I know.
It's pretty fantastic. Thank you. I bring my dolls to work. I'm going to actually ask Jamie to jump back in, because I've actually noticed a lot of comments on the side, and I know they don't always get picked up. So Jamie, can you share some of the stuff that we've started seeing pop up? And I know there was a question that was a really good one too.
Yeah. So I did want to call this out. I brought it up on the screen earlier, but somebody who joined us noted that they, for Wonder Woman specifically, the origin of the character really appeared to them after they learned about the creator's experience with his wife and their partner, and they were in a polyamorous relationship. So I just wanted to call that out. Jean Marie, I'm guessing the question that you're talking about is from Laura. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So in 2 minutes or less, somebody, our colleague Laura McGinnis was wondering if you could talk about anything that you know about how China's anti-LGBTQ policies might play into some of the film issues that we were just talking about.
It's extraordinarily significant. I can tell you that there's a lot of factors. And Wonder Woman and Black Panther are very similar in terms of the obstacles put before them to be made at the quality level and with the budget that they had. Yes, there are international markets that are not friendly to this kind of content. And for perspective, China often only allows about 10 or 12 American movies into their market a year, and they have to be previewed several months prior. There's no guarantee, but if you lose the China market, that's a big chunk of money. But it's also retailers like Walmart controls half the toy market in the US. International divisions of these big conglomerates pushed back on both of these films significantly and didn't think they would work. And so I have to give credit to people like Patty Jenkins and Kevin Feige, who fight tirelessly to get these things done. And that's what will happen with queer representation in film, because television doesn't have these obstacles.
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging issue, especially because there is so much global awareness that this is being developed. And so I think when there are these challenges, they really, really jump out. It looks like we are almost at time, unfortunately, and I need to wrap up this conversation, which breaks my heart and makes me want to do this for an hour so we can just keep nerding out together. But Eric, Court, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun. We need to do this again.
Absolutely.
Yes, please.
Thank you both, and we will definitely do it again. Thanks so much.
All
and thank you, Amy. Thanks, everybody. And that is the end of another one of our shows. I'm going to have to take my tiara off, but maybe I'll keep it on for the rest of the day. Please join us again next Thursday when we will do this again. It's something to talk about live. As we wrap up the same way every single week, run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. And most of all, please, please, please continue. Wear your mask. See you next week.